Hi, everyone. We're going to get started in a minute. Good morning or afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm going to go ahead and get started. I really want to thank you all for joining our first of the summer event in the Black Panther Oakland Community School Research Cluster series. Today's event is called The Warrior Woman: Film, the American Indian Movement, and the We Will Remember Survival School. And I just want to give some context around our Black Panther Oakland Community School Research Cluster. So at UC Irvine, this research cluster was formed in about spring 2021 to advance research, teaching, and learning about the Black Panther Party survival programs through public programs, exhibitions, community archives, and digital project development, all going towards the release of a film documentary about the Oakland Community School. And today I have the pleasure of introducing Angela LeBlanc-Ernest, as well as Dr. Elizabeth Beth Castle. I'll call you Beth. And I'll start by introducing Angela. Angela LeBlanc-Ernest is an independent scholar, a documentarian, a multimedia content creator, an oral historian, and a community archivist whose projects focus on 20th century social movement history, gender, education, and culture. She received a bachelor's in Afro-American Studies from Harvard University and an MA in history from Stanford University. She has spent her 30-year career bridging the divide between academic institutions and communities by developing and participating in projects that have public history components and incorporating narrators themselves in the process. Angela is the founding director of the OCS Project LLC, an academic research project that focuses on recovering, preserving, and sharing the oral and documentary history of the Oakland Community School, one of the Black Panther Party's educational institutions and its flagship educational program. She consults and collaborates on a variety of projects surrounding BPP history with both institutions and individuals. Most recently, she was the photographic and oral history consultant for Comrade Sisters, Women of the Black Panther Party, which was released in 2022. Author of the book's companion guide, the Comrade Sisters, Women of the Black Panther Party Discussion and Research Guide, as well as a co-organizer of the Comrade Sisters book tour. She's also a recipient of the 2022/2023 Oral History Association and National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship. Next, I'll introduce Beth, our guest. Dr. Elizabeth Castle works at the intersection of media, scholarship, and activism as an anti-racist educator committed to liberating and sharing unknown histories of resistance. She started the Warrior Woman Project, or WWP archive, to preserve the oral histories of Indigenous activists and disrupt the dominant historical narrative through her upcoming book, Women Were the Backbone, Men Were the Jawbone, Native Women's Activism in the Red Power Movement. While completing her PhD in history at Cambridge University, she worked as a policy associate for President Clinton's Initiative on Race. In 2001, she served as a delegate for the Indigenous World Association at the United Nations World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa. While working as an academic specialist for UC Berkeley's Oral History Office, she received the University of California President's Postdoctoral Fellowship at UC Santa Cruz under the supervision of Professors Angela Davis and Bettina Aptheker. She co-directed and produced the Peabody Award-nominated film Warrior Woman in 2018 that premiered on PBS in 2019 and won 13 jury awards. She continues the collective work of the WWP through developing popular education, multimedia content, and creating a community-based archive with funding support from various institutions, including Firelight Media Impact Campaign Grant, the Mellon Community Archiving Grant, Nia Taro, Resist Foundation, and the Endian Collective. She recently completed a 2022-2023 fellowship from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Oral History Association. I'll introduce myself briefly. I'm Tatiana Bryant, the Director of Teaching, Learning, and Research Services at Barnard College. I've been affiliated with the BPOCS Research Cluster out of UC Irvine now for a few years. And I'm happy to be back with you today. And I just want to remind everyone that throughout our events, feel free to add your questions or comments to the Q&A function on Zoom, and we will definitely have time at the end to answer some of them. Thank you all for joining us today, and I want to pass off to Angela now.
Thank you so much, Tatiana. Welcome, everyone, and especially good morning, Beth. Welcome to the BPOCS Research Cluster. It's actually not your first time with us. You were with us briefly last summer, but I want to welcome you today because today the focus is on the long haul work that you've done on women in the Red Power movement. And last year when we both became research fellows is when we met for the first time. And I realized that we both have been on this long haul movement, with my work being in Black Power movement respectively. So we both began our work as part of university academic programs, yet we've both moved beyond those walls to incorporate public history and community archival aspects into our work. So I just wanted to give you some time to just spend a few minutes telling us how you arrived at your current practice from where you began in graduate school.
Thank you, Angela. Can you hear me pretty well? Everything okay? I am really excited this morning. Yeah, I wanted to just thank you for bringing me into this conversation and giving me a chance to talk to the students you're working with. And of course, I think our oral history sisterhood, hopefully we'll get to talk a little bit at the end, that have joined us this morning. But you know, I have tried to come up with my origin story for so long, and every time I try to write it down, it just sounds so performed because, you know, it's so appropriate to have you ask this question because it was what, like, so much of this also, I feel like, you know, one of my subjects, narrators, interlocutors, where everything sounds like, you know, back in my day, back in the beginning, 27 years ago. Yeah, way back, I was like trying to explain how much an arc can change our trajectory. So I was working on a master's degree at the University of Cambridge in England, and I wanted to do a PhD. And I guess I also want to be clear, like, it is true, I didn't go into academia with a desire to become part of academia. I just wanted to I wanted to learn these stories, that I had learned something about these women in the Black Panther Party and the American Indian movement. And so, you know, it's 1998 and I look like I do, a white woman doing Black and Native history at a place that didn't consider that history. They didn't consider oral history a method. None of it was really something that was considered legible. And I'm sure I want to share that part as well, because I have no doubt that, you know, lots of us in this space and in general are engaging with institutions, trying to do things that the institutions are naturally going to try to repress, right, and not make space for. So, you know, it began that way. And since then, you know, I think the biggest shift for me just started when I started interviewing people and I got out into the field, if you will. I got out and I was on Cheyenne River Reservation, and I remember sitting down and I had my set of questions, and I had this image. I had a vision that I just knew that there was a history there that's absent. And I think every moment since then has been this constant expansion of my mind when it comes to the fact that, you know, all these types of projects that we do are co-creations with the people that we engage with. And that was something that I learned early on. And it, you know, it was a real point of contention, or it was something that was very difficult, because that is not how, for example, when you're like a doctoral student, your institution is not that interested in how you want to co-create work with, you know, what's defined as your subjects. So, you know, one of the things that was really important as well is that I'm sure folks in other degree programs might have had more, you know, more direct access, but I was working in a history program where, you know, the Decolonizing Methodologies book for, it's really important. It's sort of the baseline, you know, core book of doing work in Indigenous community hadn't come out yet. It had come out about 1998. So one of the things that was so important was just well, first of all, like I was looking at just the hubris of youth, that I was like, I'm going to do this, even though it's just obviously not supposed to be done. So, you know, and so that was important. But also, you know, the whole time I was constantly questioning, should I do this? Can I do this? And most of the time, the answers came from, you know, these women I was working with who were also seeing the opportunity to interview and talk with me as a chance to do two really important things that have become sort of the backbone of the Warrior Women Project, which is how can we make space for and tell histories that have not only been left out, but they've been purposely erased, that there isn't space in that narrative for it. So, and because they wanted their grandkids to know their story. And they saw that I had a camera, which was not normal for somebody even doing oral histories at the time, which would have been more of an audio practice. But I wasn't in those even spaces to sort of know those discussions. So one of the things, you know, that I think we all forget sometimes is like common sense and deep listening and empathy are all really key factors in doing what becomes community collaboration over time. And I think that's something I'd love, you know, to talk more about with you as we go on, which is, you know, it just changes what the goals are, right? In terms of what this idea of, you got to have deliverables and products and things that prove what you've been doing. And I've been looking back over the years, thinking about answering this question and just saying, you know, there's well, one of the first things that I did, and I work with one woman in particular, we became quite close, Madonna Thunderhawk, who is sort of, you know, a bad, you know, not the best reference, but sort of like the, you know, Forrest Gump of Red Power, except she was very strategic. She was part of every major occupation, action, and event that has occurred in the Red Power movement and is still as active as ever at 83. But she and I started presenting at conferences all over the world. So we had, I think we'll bring it up in a second, but there's a picture of us at the British Museum where we were giving a panel some papers on the powwow. It was a powwow conference at the British Museum. And, you know, it was all bizarre because it was 2003 and they had invited a whole bunch of academics to come over and talk intellectually about powwows. And that's just a little picture of us as babies in the basement of the British Museum. And we have been doing this ever since. This was like 2 years after we then also had gone to the World Conference Against Racism and worked on the Indigenous Caucus. That was a continuation of work that had happened in the 1970s. But, you know, I think at the end of it, a couple of things I took out of it was that I definitely I didn't necessarily want to be part of academia as it exists right now, because there were too many compromises that I had to make, but I did want to change it. And that's also some big hubris, but I think we're all there now in a lot of ways in terms of shifting, certainly the way, like the extractive nature of academia, and that I've worked hard over all these years to stay connected to community at a core level. So I know when I'm showing up in places, who I'm responsible to, who I bring with me, what these words like accountability, non-extractive work, you know, that's the part where I'm like, you know, again, back in my day at the start, these were not words that if you use them, other people didn't necessarily have an idea of what they meant. And now I think that's so important about the type of work that we're doing that crosses so many different boundaries and borders, and that you know, in your work, that was a practical measure. I was going to interview Black Panther Party women. They're all like, well, we just talked to Angela, so we don't need to talk to you. So I was always like, who is this Angela Ernest? And now we are comrade sisters.
Here we are indeed. Thank you for that. Something that definitely is important in the work we do is the ways in which we form relationships with our narrators. And so kind of, you know, the Academy calls them narrators, we often call them friends, right? Some of them are like mothers. I always tell people that women of the Black Panther Party raised me, because I started meeting women of the Black Panther Party when I was 19, formative years. And so it was wonderful to see that picture of you and Madonna Thunderhawk, because I definitely see parallels in the work that I've done, and I continue to work with those women, as well as working, you know, working through an academic lens. What I like to do is kind of jump right into it. I want to show a clip of the Warrior Woman film to provide a visual context for our conversation. So the clip is about 2.5 minutes long, and it's literally the beginning of the film. So Ekoa, can you go ahead and play the first film clip for us?
First of all, I want to ask you guys something. Listen, what holiday is it today?
Washington's birthday. Washington's birthday.
And who is he? The first person that says the father of our country, I'm gonna punch your mom.
What we try to do is preserving and maintaining our language and our ways.
Making our people survive, you know, that's important. I have 3 children myself, you know.
People think Indians always knew that we were powerful, and we always acted that way. Mm-hmm. But we didn't. Everybody accepted the racism. But during that time, people were standing up and saying, hey, yeah, I am Indian. We want to be who we are, not who you are.
This country is built on the bones of our ancestors. We have our culture, we have our way of life, we have our language. What we're trying to do is retain it. Retain our right as a people to be Indian.
It was truly an empowering, free time. Watching the women is amazing how they handled everything. Protecting our people and our children's future and fighting, being warriors in that way.
The press, they just automatically gravitated to the men. And who really knew what was going on and who was really running the show were the women.
We were a movement of families.
Being the daughter of Madonna, she definitely had a reputation of being strong. And when someone went to her for help, she did what she had to do to make a difference.
However, we get the job done, you know, whatever it takes.
Audio. Angela, we can't hear you.
I'm addressed it unmute button. Something I find striking about the film is the clear focus on the women and the children. In the opening scene, we see children walking to the building. Even before that, I noticed that, you know, when we have the logo and kind of the intro with the company name, we hear the voices of the children in the background. And so they're walking to the building that served as the meeting place for the 1975 survival school in South Dakota, and Madonna Thunderhawk is leading that conversation. Was that the intention from the beginning, or a storyline that developed during the editing phase of the film?
That is a really big question, and important, because and I'm happy to talk at length about the film process. I learned so much going and jumping into that experience, but it was probably like so I made this film with Christina King, a really talented Native filmmaker who we worked together for a decade. And the challenge with that, and this is, I think that, and this is important, is that survival school was always important. It's actually the thing that probably drew Christina more than anything, the potential of these stories, like what she saw in some of the footage I had already created, because I started to work on this before I brought her onto the film and we decided to work together. But I guess I just can't tell you how much of a struggle it was for us to center and hold our ground to having the survival school narrative be one of the major sort of strands in our braid. And our braid was sort of the metaphor for the thesis of the film, or the treatment, because it was, so this is a PBS documentary. We got funding from, like, really amazing funding from ITVS, which is really the funding that everybody wants. But the constant pressure was, how is this going to be a PBS film? And a PBS film has a certain narrative. So this is where we struggled in particular, because, and this answers some of the things we might talk about, but just the fact that like the unapologetic beauty and power and empowerment in these kids that like radiate, it just radiates, in some of the footage that we had. And it was a story we wanted to lead with, because we're absolutely not going to tell another story that's just classic, sad Native narratives. And the you know, whether we call it poverty porn, however it comes about, but we really had to fight. And this was the big thing, is that we didn't want to start with the boarding schools and follow with survival schools. And I can explain a little bit about how that came about, but basically it was, we sacrificed pretty much 4 years, a couple $100,000 and a certain placement within PBS in order to maintain the survival school narrative at the center of it. And to us, you know, the story all emanates from that. You know, you've got the future generations, you have the young people, the reason why everybody was willing to put themselves on the line, you know, for the ancestors and future generations. So once, I think now when you watch the film, I hope I still get happy watching it, because I love to watch the opening. And I love that we, instead of had like the sort of flute music of the, you know, company sponsor, one of our great, you know, supporters, Vision Maker, we chose to put the children's voices in there. So anytime we could do that, we did. And, you know, and I think this is one of the biggest untold stories of the movement era onwards, is the power and the concept of survival school.
Yeah, I think I find it interesting that you said that there were things that you had to sacrifice just to focus on the narrative that you wanted to. And I guess one of the questions that I wonder is, you've done so much over the years, which came first? Was it the Warrior Women project or the concept of the film, or did they kind of evolve in tandem? How did that work?
That when I saw that question too, I was like, ooh, you're really making me work for it, because I felt the same thing that I'm sure some of these process echo conversations that, you know, many of us who do oral history have with narrators, or friends or moms or sisters, or comrades, is the fact that I was like really looking for the chicken and the egg and thinking, how did this come about? And the one thing I can say is that the film was always an idea from the very beginning. That's why I brought a standard definition Canon Optura camera to these interviews and tried to set it up in just, again, the hubris of thinking I could do all this by myself. I'm trying to be like, you know, thank you, Grandma. Could you put the grandkids out front to play? And can we turn off the fridge? You know, things that it was just, yeah, when you get a chance in the archive to see some of these full interviews, you're all going to have to give me a lot of grace and just remember the situations I was in at the time. But also I want people to see those things, because that's real. And that's how you know, craft things and build trust and show people who you are, because they need to know who you are before they're going to share your story. And that's something I'd like to talk about as well. But you know, it was, here's the thing that I remembered last night, which was why I brought that British Museum photo of Madonna and I, because I was like, what have we been doing all these years if we haven't been producing lots of things? And what we have done is, you know, like I said, papers and panels and events all over the world. And this was the biggest thing, is that, so I finished my PhD in 2000, but most of the key interviews for this, I just kept doing interviews. So it wasn't, I didn't even necessarily have the plan, and Madonna and I, in particular, but also Marcy, her daughter, did end up applying for, somehow the Ford Foundation had some like extra money in couch cushions. And we wrote a grant that was about like the Warrior. So I used the Warrior Women Project as a name and a description back in 2006, 2005, 2006. So I think that this concept of archive, which I wasn't thinking of at the time, just the fact that this moved very much from the beginning from this individual research question concept, from extractive, you know, work in an academy to collectively held collaboration between, you know, sort of, and it wasn't everybody, it's not one big happy family, right? But each time we interviewed somebody, we expanded, because of course they share who else we need to know. So over the years, the Warrior Women Project has existed in various forms. But the film was something that started sort of officially with funding with the Ford Foundation, and then with Vision Maker Media when we got a nice chunk of money, and then really concentrated on filming and upped our game significantly, high definition camera, at least in the early 2000s, but from about 2009 to 2018.
Wow, I was smiling and shaking my head on my end, because that sounds much like how the OCS project started as an archival project. I started out interviewing people who had attended the school, the Oakland Community School, or taught at the school, interviewing them and filming the interviews with the concept of documentary film in mind. And as I met more people and they shared more material and connections to other people, I felt like there's so much more here, so much more. And so that's how I ended up with an archival project as well, because as you know, you do a film and I can only imagine what is on your what was on the cutting room floor, right? And so for me, it was trying to figure out how in the world are we going to share this other information that's so critical about the school. And I just decided it was time to figure out, outside of the academy, university setting, figure out kind of as a community archivist, I guess now is what they call it, how I could help preserve that history as I continue to work on these other projects and, collaborate with folk. Madonna, I think Madonna mentioned survival. You mentioned the concept of survival. The Black Panther Party used the word survival as a descriptor for its greater than 60 community programs. Bobby Seale, one of the co-founders of the Black Panther Party, named them survival programs pending revolution. And for the Panthers, the community school was under that heading of survival program. Can you talk about the concept of survival for the American Indian movement as your narrator shared with you, and those who created the AIM survival schools? Like what were the reasons for doing it? And then we'll show another clip, this one specifically, when you requested we share about the survival schools themselves.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I will say before I go super deep into the survival idea is just the fact that when you say like the cutting room floor, like we have another film entirely. We have 2 films. And that's before we even get into the 10 years of footage behind that. And this is not even including the oral history collection itself. So that was such a big deal. And that's important because the difference, and that has so much to do with how we tried to shift this into a really indigenous thinking space that reflected, the circle of history rather than, the linear narrative, the linear chronology of history, and really getting deep into that. So that is a big deal. And we're trying to figure out what we do with a lot of that content, because as far as I'm concerned, and exactly what you said, like all of this content matters. And I want it to be, it's one of the methods that we want to push and share and be a part of in oral history fields is that, when doing film or writing book or whatever you're doing, that you're always making your oral histories available for people to see and understand the thought process, the ways in which you as an individual have pulled from these collective stories of others. But, it's so interesting because the idea of survival, again, is one of those that has all these layers, and folks from very different perspectives think very different things. And it's like the challenge you have every time you're sitting down and trying to start with, how do we not spend most of our time trying to unpack and unlearn things so that we can learn start where we want to start. And so survival, means both things at once, the physical needs of survival on a fundamental level, but the concept of survival school or survival was really the fundamental thing that we open the film with, you know, that Madonna says as well, which is the cultural right to exist, the cultural right to be, the surviving erasure, and surviving, you know, there's, you know, Gerald Visner and there's other, you know, intellectual strains about like the concept of survivance, but on the front lines, grassroots level of folks like the American Indian movement who, you know, fundamentally brought us a revitalization of Indigenous identity we would not have otherwise. The framing was the fact that, you know, this is what's worth dying for. This is what ancestors died for. This is what future generations need, is the survival of Indigenous lifeways, Indigenous thinking, culture, language. That's survival.
Ekua, can you go ahead and play the survival school clip, the second clip from the video? And on the other side of it, Beth, we'll talk a bit more about why you chose that clip specifically.
Where did Maggie go? Nah, they're jive anyway, otherwise they'd be here, right? Right. Okay, let's go.
One thing that Philip, my son, said was, I don't want to go to school. We should have our own school. And then I thought, well, yeah, I'm not going to put my kids in this school system anywhere. You know, I didn't trust them. And so then started out for my kids and my nieces and nephews. And then it just mushroomed on us. Pretty soon we just had all these kids coming to our door.
Our school is, well, I don't even know if you could call it a school. We all live and work together in Rapid City. Many of our students are children that have dropped out of the present education system. Not only dropped out, but have been forced out due to the language barriers and the cultural barriers.
I remember waking up and looking around and thinking, what do people think? Because there's bodies everywhere.
Oh yeah, in the yard.
You know, in the yard and under the trailer, and you know, because there's like 40 kids with a 2-bedroom, you know. And that's how we slept. Remember, we had little groups instead of second grade, third grade, or I think we had the Hochschila Shapa gang, the Dirty Bum gang,
The Sovereignty Sisters.
The Sovereignty Sisters.
Oh yes, the Sovereignty Sisters.
We were constantly braiding hair.
And Travis's hair only grew this long, but he'd get in line. And then we'd ask him, do you
behind
want...
the ears,
Yeah.
over the ears, one braid, tight, up high.
He'd sit down and go, I want 2 long, thick, black braids. And I was so happy just to be able to be with her and be, you know, to be part of all this stuff that she was doing.
You folks always seem to be traveling around.
Last year we went all over. Last year we went through California and down into Arizona and to Farmington. We went to Mexico, Seattle, Oregon. And we visited different reservations.
Went and visited other tribal people who were having their own struggles. That was our classroom. We went to ceremonies and sweats and went to the Wounded Knee trials, you know, being involved in the issues of the day.
Beth, can you tell us why you thought that that was a poignant clip to share with us today?
First of all, that clip was not in the film. Some of those scenes were in the film. That's a piece that's from the first version of the film. And I mean, and this answers a few things, but one of my favorite moments has always been watching the school photos populate into sort of the, you know, Brady Bunch. And you know, they're unapologetically big, jaw-hurting Indian smiles that are like, who smiles in a school picture anyway, that isn't, you know, something where we look back and make fun of them, right? But, you know, they're just so beautiful. And, you know, it was a chance to see just that, to catch a little bit of the air of the liberatory freedom, the power of taking young people out of systems that are violent, like we call it education, we call it school. And that's one of the things that is a constant trope that I think I'm definitely working on in the book. And it's something we need to talk about in terms of that sort of comparative and relational experience with Oakland Community School, is just that, you know, over and over, it's actually called the We Will Remember Survival Group. But that's what they decided to name it, not school. But we keep using the term school because it's the only way we can make it legible for people. But for it's a place of freedom. It's a place that is totally against what the construct of school is meant to do as the final, the sort of final solution, if you will, of the US government to assimilate and destroy Native identity through the concept of boarding school. And so it just has so much packed into it. It's so powerful. And, you know, one of the other things that always comes to mind for me is that when I was first doing this way back when I was, you know, doing the PhD and I'm looking at the Black Panther Party and AIM, there were secondary sources out there that said very little. And at some place it was like, oh, there's a community school, or the Panthers had a school. That's all it said. And at some point, I know in the very first interview I did with Madonna, and somewhere, you know, she just referenced like survival school. And I was like, well, what does this mean? What do you mean you started a school? Yeah, that's where I realized, I was like, this is really important because of the way it was talked about and the energy behind it, even though in the secondary sources it had been sort of like, you know, and as we recount the organizations and the date and the leaders and their full titles, here are the list of things that they may have done. And, you know, the good women did, you know, it's almost like nursing and teaching, right? This whole patriarchal idea that it's not that important. It's the support work, help work that women do. But this is all part of what happens when you start to like destroy that dominant narrative and put the power where the power is, or let the power be there and the balance be there with what women do. So that is one of my favorite clips. It needs a little work and there's bits of it, but also everybody's just remembering, you know, their cheerleading group, their spirit group, they were the Sovereignty Sisters, right? And that was like a really big deal in like 1975 to be using that phrase at that time when we weren't using sovereignty yet. So I love it.
When I watched the film, one of the things I really loved was seeing Madonna Thunderhawk, the footage of them in the Bay Area, and hearing them talk about inspiration from the United Farm Workers and the Black Panther Party, and really seeing the proof, right? The proof that they work together. So knowing it and seeing it were really wonderful. And when it was explained sort of how the things that they did on a daily basis, the children in the survival school, it made me immediately think about the motto for the Black Panthers Oakland Community School, which is "The world is a child's classroom," taking children outside of four walls and allowing them to learn from all types of things. And one of the things that was mentioned in the second clip was the fact that they went to the Wounded Knee trials as part of their curriculum, so to speak. The Warrior Women Project just did Wounded Knee tribute. I don't want to call it a tribute, but I want you to spend about a minute or so. We're getting ready to transition into Q&A from the audience. So if any of the attendees want to drop questions for Beth in the Q&A section, please do so. And Michaela, one of our summer cluster fellows, will curate and share those questions. But until then, Beth, can you talk a little bit about kind of that idea that the children, the AIM folks saw it as important for the children to attend those trials, and then what your Wounded Knee 50th anniversary events were meant to capture and honor?
Yeah, we're getting really wonderfully overwhelmed with making connections right now. I've been talking with my team about sort of how we can make legible or understandable to people like what a big deal this was for us, and also for the field. We want people to understand the fact that, so we had an honoring. I was like, here's our little sticker honoring the women of Wounded Knee, using some photograph, illustration of photographs, and these are all the actual women who were from primarily Pine Ridge at the time, saying we are the reason for Wounded Knee. And so we call it, well, and it was described as an honoring. And that's one of the things I was just really having these epiphanies last night in particular, is the fact that the practice of honoring, of gathering and honoring, is so important. And it's where we are telling and sharing history. And it happens naturally. And so so it was the 50th anniversary of the 1973 occupation of Wounded Knee. And that's part of my book. And I have a number of interviews, because one of the things that was important and also kicked off this archive concept way back in the day and working with other women was the fact that I had gotten to and interviewed a handful of the women who were sort of junior elders at the time, so they have passed away. So I was the only person who had interviewed some women like Geraldine Janice and Ellen Movescamp, who were the key women who basically called for and set off what, put into motion what became the occupation of Wounded Knee, that has, echoed globally and become really a watershed moment in the Red Power movement for Indigenous rights globally. But the thing that's so, and this is, again, the questions that you were kind of having me think about beforehand, is that anytime in the Red Power movement, or anytime in this movement of like extended Indian family groups that, whether it was the fishing rights struggle in the Pacific Northwest, or the Alcatraz, or the founding of AIM, or everything that happens after Wounded Knee, which is so important about these interconnections and about what solidarity and action looks like, how people are working together to stop uranium mining, for example, led by this core group of Native women, is the fact that every time they gathered, they ended up creating a type of survival school, right? And so that's why I say the word school is always this thing where people are like, oh, it's not quite right. But it's like, you have a chance to engage young people in like the unbridled, unapologetic sense of self that they need, that they are not getting. That it's not that they're just not getting it in dominant school systems, it's that they are experiencing violence done to their sense of selves, let alone their history. And I believe that, this is where we do so much violence nationally, like the violence to our national identity. We don't know who we are, right? Because we don't tell our history, because we can't face it in all these other ways. And what does we mean? But in this case, at this anniversary exhibition, like we're still trying to figure out what to do with it. But what we created was about a 16 panel, give or take, drop down banners of individual women whose interviews are part of the collection. And we have, some tablets and ways that you can listen to it on your phone as well, but of short oral history clips that describe the elements of Wounded Knee that give you the fullest sense of the picture, not just that few sentence summary that you may see in a textbook, but this whole expansive idea of that cultural right to survive and be, and to have the ability to maintain and create and foster, Indigenous ways of being and governance and life ways. And so it was really powerful, and lots of honorings just happened at it. Like so much history was shared, and networks and things were created there that we're now trying to figure out, because we want to do a survival school oral history gathering because that's what we did also at the site. We did on-site oral history so people could see this is how, this isn't a mystery. Your voice or story isn't sucked into some, you know, institutional machine and spit out somewhere where it's going to support somebody's career only. But here's the cycle. So we're really excited about it, and we're really trying to move forward with building curricula, and we need support. So this is where I think you and I are going to be working together. Just saying.
Where can people see some of that material that you created and some highlights of the Wounded Knee exhibit that you did?
Well, I have a great tiny team of superheroes who did all this work in a really short period of time. And one of the things we created was we have a landing page. So even though our website is still, and stay with us, it is behind the times right now in a lot of other ways, because we're about to put out a whole lot of new things. But warriorwomen.org/WK50, which I believe it's available in the chat, so you can see it there as well. And that is a landing page that has not the entire exhibit virtually. We are going to have that available in some ways, but it does have an intro video that will take you through the show, sort of about 5 or 6 minutes of following some of the women engaging with the banners and just seeing for the first time, you know, this way in which we honored the women. And this was held again, also in Pine Ridge, in the closest site we could to what was Wounded Knee. So it was in Porcupine, South Dakota, and that was our goal. And that's the thing that we're trying to work with now. We put this together sort of so quickly in about two months that we didn't have a full-fledged plan for where it was going to go after that. And that's the other part, is like, when you are working in community, you don't come with the plan. You come with the idea and the energy and the skill set, and then you do what you can to move it forward based on what people see and want. So we're trying to balance that out now, but it is the case that we are looking for ways to have this exhibit travel. We're looking for funding so we can get it back to the schools. So the first people that engage with it are going to be the grandkids and great grandkids of the women who are in this exhibit, who haven't seen or known anything about what their grandmother did. And that's what we experienced at the exhibit site. And that was awesome.
That is absolutely wonderful. What you said about how the work gets done resonates, because I think about how the Panthers did their community organizing, and the key word was community being involved in the conversation, community expressing a need and figuring out how to partner with the community so that it makes sense to the community, and that we're not trying to bring community something that community doesn't need, but engaging in that process. I think is so important. I don't see any questions yet, and I'm always chock full of questions, but one of the things that I want to end this conversation with is having you reflect a little bit more and tell us about what's been the most challenging aspect of the community archival process for you. But then on the flip side of that, what's been the most rewarding part of that same process?
That is one that is definitely, you know, one answer serves both sort of thing, where I've had the experience, you know, it's fun when you're older and you can be like, I was just ahead of my time, right? And you know, it's true. Like, we were doing things, like I said, I showed up to study, you know, women in the Black Panther Party in AIM at the University of Cambridge. That was just like, well, that's not history, madam, right? Like, just, and everything about what you're doing is wrong and we don't understand. But I did it anyway, because I had already started my own experience. And I wasn't about to stop, because, you know, just like everything, once you know, you can't not know, right? You can't unsee things. And when it comes to, so part of the experience with the community archiving is I know what an archive is, but it's only been like, so it's been really beautiful because there's a community archiving movement, right? There's a burgeoning thing that's been happening. And it's gone on for a long time. I don't even know the full histories of it, but we're really privileged to be a part of this sort of nascent early group of folks who are creating something. And you can, I don't remember the exact website, but it hasn't really been launched fully, but there's a community archives collaborative. And I know that the Mellon Foundation, for example, funded and started in 2019, 2020, grants to support community archives with the goal and desire, hopefully, we're working it out, we're fighting the man as needed, but to create a lot more independence and not force or allow community groups to have to be at the will of institutions who have, this is where I know some of the folks who might be in the groups here can speak more directly, who have that library experience. But the fact that that you're not signing away anything legally. You're not giving away your stories or your content to an institution that can choose to then do whatever it wants and make it part of the, settler colonial narrative and it all be lost. In this case, it's exciting to be at this stage where we're still sort of arguing some of it out. But one of the things that, and this, I don't know if you had this experience in some of the work that you did, Angela, but when I did like my defense for my PhD, I was going into it and my supervisor had told me right before I went in, he's like, I never had any idea what you've been doing. Like, I just didn't understand it. It just was like, he just was like, I have no idea how you're going to do. If you fail, you do fail. You don't get another chance, right? And you need to know Black and Native history, all of it. And I went in and it was the first time in the history of Cambridge in the history department, there were 2 women who were my examiners. And the first thing they said was basically, your oral history work was everything. Like, that was so powerful. Nobody's ever done this. And that's the first time I was just like, whew, because I hadn't had anyone really even say like, this is a legitimate method, and was just doing my best to be accountable, to use common sense, to be transparent, all things that I think are super important. Even as we have these new methodologies we can follow, it doesn't mean we just tick that box, right? Where there's still humanity involved. And so the same thing with the community archiving, realizing that like we are doing it right. And that it is going to be a process and it's slow. And, right now the challenge is just sort of reframing where we're not trying to like do that, turbo capitalism, produce something every few years. But when can we show people what we're doing in a way so that they can, we can do more mutual aid, we can do things to support us so that we can continue doing this work. But yeah, it's right now something I'm really excited about.
Yeah, that is amazing. I remember when I was in grad school in the early 90s, and I had a professor in the history department tell me that I was doing current events. And,
Right.
and
That's
you
not
know
history.
what? I'm so glad that I stuck with it, because that could be discouraging, right, to a student, to have an established professor say to you, oh, what you're doing is current events, as if it's not, as if those lives don't matter in terms of the stories that they have, the experiences they've had that need to be captured because they are historic, right? Those lives were important. And so I'm glad that we both stayed the course with our oral history endeavors, because I think that they are paying off. And I think people are learning a lot from what we managed to capture. And there's still stories, they're still waiting to be recorded and captured. And so this is, I think, a critical moment even for us to continue the work. We've come to the end of, unfortunately, the formal part of the conversation, and I wanted to invite Elliot, our intern, to close us out. And Beth, I'll see you on the other side of this in a separate conversation. Elliot?
Yes, I would like to thank all the attendees and of course, thank Dr. Beth Castle for all her great responses and Angela for moderating some of our conversations so far. There are two more speakers this summer on July 31st, each one, Teach One, the Oakland Community School in Life and Autobiography with Erica Watkins, and then another one on August 14th, Education and Ruining Insubmissive Practices meeting at the Crossroads of Black Diaspora with Ellen Sindra. So if you are able to, please join us for those following speakers with the OCS Research Cluster.
Thank you, everyone.